Everyone, Sean here. I'm your regular Cultivo Podcast host. I'm just here to introduce this special episode of the podcast in which our co-founder and CEO, Manuel Piñuela, interviews Mark Tercek. Now, Mark has a long history in nature finance and conservation, having led Goldman Sachs' first environmental efforts and then serving for 11 years as the CEO of the Nature Conservancy. You might have heard of it. It is the world's largest environmental nonprofit organization. He's also the author of Nature's Fortune. It's a great book I'm reading now, in which he makes the case that investing in nature is the smartest move that any business or government can make. Mark currently serves on Cultivo's board of directors. We're super lucky to have him. He's an incredibly well-respected voice in our space. For my own part, it was an honor to meet someone who's done so much to protect and preserve the places that I love. In this conversation, Mark and Manuel focus on the idea of nature as infrastructure and all of the ecosystem services and benefits that it provides. But they also touch on a number of other interesting topics. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm very happy to have with me Mark Tercek. Mark and I have been working together for now several years, but I've had the pleasure of meeting him after reading his book, Nature's Fortune. And actually, it was one of those books that crystallized a lot of the ideas around the formation of Cultivo. And so, without further ado, Mark has had a terrific career from finance at Goldman Sachs to then moving into the Nature Conservancy and having a direct impact into regenerating nature, conserving nature, and figuring out many different ways to make the case for investing in nature more and more attractive. Since then, he's been lifting many boats. One of those, of course, Cultivo, as not only an advocate, but also a board member in Cultivo, as well as many other businesses that are really focused into many of the multiple crises that our planet is going through. So, Mark, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Manuel. It's nice to be here.
So let's jump straight into one of the things that you and I discussed close to 6 years ago, which was, how did you get into the nature business?
It's kind of interesting. I was a very late convert to nature. I grew up in the city of Cleveland. It was a fine place to grow up, kind of an immigrant, working class, rough and tough neighborhood. Good place to grow up, but it was completely an urban environment. And then I went on for decades being an urban person. So I had nothing against nature, and I spent plenty of time outdoors, but I really wasn't a nature-minded person or an environmentalist. And my wife, Amy, also grew up in Ohio, and she also was kind of an urban person. Again, nothing against nature, but it wasn't really a priority for us. But when we became parents, we have 4 now adult children. When we became parents, we made a real effort to get them exposed to the outdoors. And we started with day trips, then weekend trips, then real eco adventures. And at the same time, I guess we're geeks. We made an effort to understand what we were, learning about. And the inner environmentalist woke up in me. I think that's noteworthy because then I learned that the Nature Conservancy, what was my job, to convert people into supporting nature. I think there's an inner environmentalist in most people. I think it's just part of our human code. So anyway, for me, it was really fun to discover as an adult how joyous experiences in nature can be and how extraordinary ecosystems are. The other thing I'll note is I was a business person. As soon as I got out of school, I became a business person. And I was a business person who felt that business could be a force for good. I still feel that way. Obviously, business doesn't always get it right. But by and large, I think business can be a force for good. Cultivo is a great example. So those two things came together for me. I learned about nature. I learned, of course, the threat nature was under. And I thought, maybe I could even play a role in helping business figure out how to do a better job of protecting nature in ways that would make business sense, because I thought that would scale and accelerate and would just simply be positive.
And I really like that part that you mentioned of the inner environmentalist. I think even a bit like you with Cultivo, I've been discovering, and part of the culture of the business is that from software developers to recovering hedge fund managers, they all have an inner environmentalist that really drives, I think, this effort in a very complex industry. But let's start digging into that complex industry. And maybe as a first point of view, one thing that we continue to experience in Cultivo is that investing in nature or investing in natural capital can mean many different things. So what does investing in nature mean for you?
Yeah, I'm glad you're asking that question. I gave it so much thought when I worked at the Nature Conservancy. So I joined the Nature Conservancy in 2008 as CEO. What a great opportunity for me. I was so fortunate. At the time, before I arrived, in other words, TNC was a mighty environmental NGO, the biggest and I would argue one of the most effective, and with a great track record of saving nature at scale. So then when I was there with my senior team and with the board support, we thought hard about our strategy. And because we were so much bigger and better resource than other NGOs, we thought, well, we should be the organization that does the really big things that if we don't take them on, they won't get done. And so that drove a lot of our thinking. 11 years I was at TNC. So then what does it take to protect nature at scale? Well, lots of things, but importantly, it takes a lot of people and allies, if you will, in part because you need political clout. So I thought we needed more people on our side, and it's capital intensive, as you know, at Cultivo. And so I thought we needed more money on our side. Now, TNC's was a huge organization at the time I joined, great supporters, lots of financial resources. Still, relative to the scale of what we wanted to do, we needed more. So then how to do that? Well, of course, and it's so fortunate that this is true, there are a lot of people who believe it is a priority to save nature just for nature's sake. I think I'm one of those people today. And fortunately, there are a lot of people like that. And organizations like TNC and Cultivo should do everything they can to grow the number of people who prioritize protecting nature, period. But no matter how effective we are at growing that support group and their financial resources, we'll always need more. There's so much to do. And so then I had been an investment banker, of course. So naturally, I thought about taking a business case or an investment case for protecting in nature. I didn't invent this. Professors had been talking about so-called ecosystem services, all the practical benefits that nature produces and delivers to benefit humankind and other species. But as CEO of the Nature Conservancy, particularly as a CEO who used to work on Wall Street, about which people were curious, why did a guy from Wall Street end up at the Nature Conservancy? I had a good opportunity to be kind of a spokesperson for investing in nature. So that was why I wrote the book. I'm not really a writer, and it was a pretty easy book for me to write, Nature's Fortune. But it made the case why humankind and society and business should be as careful and as thoughtful as possible when it would be possible to view nature as an asset. And the argument I make in the book, and I used to make all the time, is everybody understands when you have traditional infrastructure, so-called gray infrastructure, man-made infrastructure, factories, machines, bridges, ports, you name it. Naturally, that requires capital investment to put that stuff together. And naturally, the organizations associated with that take good care of it. You want to maintain that equipment so that it will deliver the services for which it was originally built and designed. So I thought then, well, we'll make that same argument for green infrastructure. This time nature, because nature also provides really valuable services, the kinds of things I have in mind. Well, when I wrote the book, I wrote about New York City, who at one point in its history was ordered by the federal government to make more than $1 billion investment in a new plant to keep its drinking water clean. But some very smart government officials realized that they could do something better and save money by protecting the upstream watershed for New York City, mostly using funds to help farmers do their business differently, to curtail certain developments, to protect different parts of the ecosystem that were responsible for producing and delivering clean water. And so this is one of these win-win-wins. The city saved money. Investments in ecosystems cost less than the investment in the plant. The dollars helped rural communities, farmers, and other people in those rural communities through good investments. And those dollars not only protected the green infrastructure that sourced the water, but of course it also meant protecting beautiful ecosystems that benefit people for recreational purposes, or trees and grasslands that, as you know, at Cultivo, can sequester carbon, ecosystems that provide protection from storms, and so on and so on. So the argument was, let's be as thoughtful as we can be about identifying when there can be investments in green infrastructure that work, that save money, and deliver these multiple benefits. Because if that's true, we should then agree those are investments we should make. Of course, the other thing that's happening is you're helping people discover their own inner environmentalists. If you work on something like this with government officials, we did this all the time at TNC. I'm sure you guys do it at Cultivo. You take business people or government officials to an ecosystem to understand how, in your case, it might remove carbon from the atmosphere. But at the same time, you're in the beautiful ecosystem itself. You're learning how all the components of nature work together. And voila, the inner environmentalist is awoken.
That is fantastic, Mark, because one of the parts that you just had there in your description of what investing in nature is, as well as what green infrastructure is, one of those things that clearly that project was able to do was to demonstrate for other investors that nature is not this niche asset class that you need a lot of complexity to understand. Of course it is complex, but every infrastructure project is complex. But there was so many, how can I call them, ninja moves that you described there pithily on how did you describe this project for your Wall Street investors to look at this project as any other asset class? So do you mind just sharing a bit more as to what are those lessons learned that you've acquired through the years to make sure that nature is seen just as a good infrastructure investment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a kind of a complicated question, Manuel, because the first thing that happened in response to me talking along these lines is that hardcore conservationists, true blue nature lovers, sometimes were offended. They said, hold on, Mark, you're commoditizing nature. I always push back. They said, you're commoditizing nature. Nature is not an asset to be monetized. It's something to be treasured and prioritized and loved and protected. I always said, I agree with you. I view nature the same way, but we face real challenges. Nature faces huge challenges. And again, we need more people and more money on our side. And by broadening the lens by which we understand the benefits of nature, we can get more people and more money on our side, and we can even convert people to being true blue lovers of nature. So I didn't back away when challenged, but I was kind of surprised at how aggressively I was challenged. And so then what I would say to those environmentalists, look, I always say, I admire you. You're my heroes for protecting nature for these intrinsic values, but I would encourage them to be more open-minded because, again, having more people in this modern economy, in modern politics, having more people on your side is, I think, incontrovertibly a good thing. That's especially true today, regrettably, because political leaders find it so advantageous, I guess, to exacerbate divisiveness and divides and polarization. Wish that weren't the case, but that seems to be the way political leaders view it. And I think that's very harmful for society and making progress. What's great about nature is, I believe, even in today's most contentious political circumstances, is that we can use it as an opportunity to find more common ground and help people understand they have far more in common with their political opponents than they sometimes appreciate. The other side of the coin is the business community. I found the business community quite receptive. Business people are a little bit different. I mean, again, I'm generalizing, so I want to be careful. But business people tend to be pretty pragmatic. And I would say by and large, their reaction was, really? There's a lower cost way to achieve what we want by investing in nature, and we get other co-benefits for free? That sounds too good to be true, Mark. Please prove it's the case, because if it is, we'll support that. And that was important pushback, because what I learned then was, in some cases, while we at TNC had a kind of high level almost poetic justification of such investments, you have to make sure it really works, because when you're talking about the private sector making investments in infrastructure, it needs to work. There was an example. I think it's in the book, but I'll do this on a no-names basis because I can't remember how specific I was in the book. But a Fortune 100 CEO was interested in this argument of mine and TNC's. So he engaged us to think about how his company could find opportunities to invest in nature. And one of their plants was in the Gulf of Mexico, very vulnerable to storm and sea level rise. And so we believe coastal ecosystems will provide the protection you need at lower costs and all these co-benefits, et cetera. And he said, great, prove it. Then we dove in and tried to prove it. It turned out in that case, unfortunately, the ecosystems couldn't work. We couldn't grow the right ecosystems robustly enough to provide the protection that we needed. The moral of that story for us at TNC was fine. We're not saying green infrastructure is always the best thing to do. Just examine whether it might be, because there are numerous benefits for it being the case. Anyway, I think the key point, though, is I'm rambling too much. The key point is, when talking about these things with anyone, is to be respectful, to explain it in a common sense way, and to try to grow the number of constituents for nature.
And I think that, look, that resonates a lot on both sides. So let me reflect a bit of our own experience at Cultivo, that those deeper blue conservationists are actually our ecosystem partners. And I think a big change that is happening in the planet, as you just mentioned, is that they are looking and seeking, I think, with a broader mindset as to how to find permanent capital that be connected to those ecosystems that they love and protect so much. So I think that is the other side of this very sharp blade that is making them think this way as well. That's aligning more and more towards those institutional investors. And the part that, just on that example that you mentioned that didn't work, I think building the book of those investments that really worked and contrasting them to those that didn't, to then accelerate the identification or origination through now new technologies as we're developing at Cultivo with AI that allow you to forecast, basically have a better prediction of that risk-adjusted return, is also starting to give confidence. But on that, let me tap into one point on your example in New York. I think that the industry is starting to discover, because of all the different higher frequency, high intensity impacts of changing climate, that a big reason for investment is decreasing the risk of a region. And so in that investment, or in any other example that you want to bring, was the driving force of the investment of creating green infrastructure to reduce risk, flooding or droughts or fires, rather than just the IRR?
Well, I think in the case of the New York City investment in ecosystems to secure clean water for drinking purposes, I think in that case, it was primarily dollar and cents, which is remarkable, right? In that case, the city concluded it could save money by investing in ecosystems rather than building a plant. And all the other good stuff, which would provide risk reduction services, does provide risk reduction services, that was all free. That all just came on top. But that New York City example is kind of famous because that was one of the first headline instances when this happened in a big way. The world has come a long way since my book was published more than 10 years ago. And of course, it's really positive to see this. And the work that you do at Cultivo is, I think, really a great example. I will admit, at the time I wrote the book, when one of the ecosystem services that we had in mind, I say we, the royal we, the big community of conservation practitioners, we did have the notion clearly in mind that investments in ecosystems could remove carbon from the atmosphere. So we were excited about that. What a great new way to motivate investments in forests, grasslands, mangroves, you name it. And we were right at a high level. But it was early days. And then as things proceeded along, I think first NGOs tried to do those projects by themselves, and it proved to be difficult because it was a new marketplace. And if a company was any entity was going to buy a so-called carbon credit and make claims against that, then there needed to be a robust methodology to ensure that the credit stood up to those claims. There were some deals done. I don't think it was, early deals weren't perfectly successful along those lines. And so there was a lot of kerfuffle about all that. But I think that's all been very positive in allowing a new marketplace to kind of get its act together. I also think it's been very positive to see how NGO types like my former organization, the Nature Conservancy, work with private sector players like Cultivo, as well as government officials and indigenous communities. It's a long list. But the private sector will always be able to do some things better than the NGO community, faster at raising capital, probably more nimble, et cetera. NGOs will be able to do things that will be hard for private companies to do because some things take longer timeframes than private companies can easily raise capital for, et cetera. So I've been encouraged to see partnerships between the NGOs, civil society on the one hand, private sector on the other, and then together they work with the organizations responsible for evaluating and ensuring these programs work. Everybody coming together. It's really a tremendous amount of progress in a pretty short time. Sometimes people think, oh gosh, this is so complicated because a project will be criticized. I would flip that around and say, it's good that projects are being scrutinized and then we're understanding how they should have been shaped differently to perform even better, because that increased know-how is what will make things work better going forward.
Well, and I think that one thing that we're seeing in the market right now, I would say accelerating over the last 3 years, is that more acknowledgement of this longer time horizon, more permanent capital to these projects is starting to happen. And you're starting to see the likes of pension funds or super annuity funds, more patient capital moving into the space. I know, as you said, it's been many years since the writing of that book, but I know that you're deeply rooted in the whole space. Are you seeing that momentum also growing for more permanent capital?
There's no question about it that the private sector writ large has stepped up, I think, in a very big way. Now, I'm not saying they get everything exactly right. And it's good that there are critics out there keeping a close eye on their environmental behaviors, because I think that motivates improved performance. But by and large, companies, if we just take the U.S., for example, where companies, there are some exceptions, and there are some state mandatory carbon programs, although they're not very tough programs in the sense that they're asking for big reductions in emissions. But beyond that, you're seeing many companies step up and voluntarily invest capital in carbon removal. I think that's really positive. You can tell me in a moment, isn't it the case that those are the customers for Cultivo's projects? And then it also is the case that long-term investors are providing so-called patient capital. That, I think, is sort of logical, though, because if you're a long-term investor, you're obliged to be taking a long-term view of opportunities and risks. And of course, harm from climate change is a pretty high item on the risk list. And so it would make sense that investors then are mindful of that, and it guides their investments. But, here we are, it's mid-April 2025. There's a lot of discouraging political news happening these days. And sometimes I'm discouraged. But when I step back and think about how hard the private sector continues to work, not in every case, but broadly speaking, in pursuing environmental progress, I find it pretty encouraging. And I'm really glad. Tell me, though, about your experience. How does it look from your desk at Cultivo, Manuel?
Yeah, I think to your point that we're seeing this growing tide, lifting tide across that whole spectrum. And one item that I wanted to reflect of what you mentioned there from a political perspective and with government officials. Perhaps one of the most gratifying experiences that I've had in Cultivo is that once you're in the field and you're speaking to the landowners that are part of our projects, and you're bringing there those voluntary corporates that are becoming the off-takers of those ecosystem services, as well as the investors that are deploying the capital to regenerate that ecosystem, that political divisiveness does not exist.
Right.
And for sure know that they see the world very differently if I would ask them that question at that point. But what I think nature does is that it breaks that political divisiveness, because you have that inner environmentalist that you're just seeing this amazing grassland that could be way, way better, or this amazing forest that is degraded but still beautiful and it could be better. And there's no one in that cohort of people with all of those different actors that is not aligned to that. And that translates into those local government officials, both state and federal. And I'm not only referring to the US. We're seeing this across the world, is the fact that at least in that bubble, in the one that is very connected to the project, everyone is pushing forward. But one of the things that I love about your newsletter, The Instigator, is that you go further all the way to where are the decision makers, and how to also, I think it's a long-term play, is how do you start nudging them to change? So is there any things or suggestions that Cultivo and our peers could be doing to take that momentum, groundswell momentum, and push it up to those decision makers?
I think it's a really timely question. First, thank you for mentioning my newsletter. Everybody listening to this podcast, please subscribe to my newsletter. It's called The Instigator. It's free. It's on Substack. And in a practical way, we try to talk about issues just like this. Manuel, your question's really important, I think. Can nature somehow be used, or can the work of Cultivo somehow be used as a springboard toward more consensus, less divisiveness in politics? I almost can't think of a more important question for this moment in time. Earlier this week, I had a meal with the chairperson of a big NGO that is in the business of protecting nature for hunters. So, I'm a vegan animal lover, not a hunter, but who cares? This is a group of people who hunting is a priority for them. It has been for generations. They understand if they want to continue to hunt, they need to protect the ecosystems where the animals they hunt originate and where they want to do their activity. And it happens that this organization, I think it's fair to say, kind of leans Republican. That's my general impression. And the group is meeting in D.C. next week, and we'll be calling on political leaders in Congress, senators, congresspersons, et cetera, and urge them to one by one meet with those elected officials, remind them how much their constituents care about conservation, and to explicitly note this: they don't view it as a partisan issue or a tree-hugging priority. No, this is something that just about all people have in common. They want to protect ecosystems, and they don't only just want to do it now. If you ask most people, wherever they are in the political spectrum, they care about this for their children and grandchildren, etc. They take a long view. I think, unfortunately, in today's divisiveness especially, we lose sight of that, and we lose an opportunity to lower the temperature in the political discussion rooms, find more common ground. I think we can do it on these issues, and I think then you can build and take on even more difficult issues. And is Cultivo in a place to do some of this? I think you are. I hope you'll prioritize that kind of work.
Yeah, and also timely there, because in a lot of the biomes and ecosystems that we operate, exactly this example of hunting is a real thing for those landowners, right? So in many cases, they make more money out of proper licensed hunting than the cattle or the other animal or the other agroforestry operations that they have. And from a landowner's perspective, what they are very aware of is that the better the infrastructure to support all of that life is, the easier it's going to be for them to continue to support that landscape that they depend on and that they actually love. So I agree. I think that and going back to a couple of questions back, this is where I'm also seeing a lot of flexibility from conservationist groups as well.
Yeah.
I don't think they see that clash that sometimes is seen in between hunting and preserving an ecosystem. It sometimes is fundamental in some of those designs. So I agree that pushing those, as an immigrant, I don't have a lot of power because I cannot vote, but the core driver that I think resonates a lot with our ecosystem of partners is that they have direct connections to those political appointees and government officials trickle that essence of their existence up to the hill or wherever Congress or Parliament, as it pertains to their country.
Another way to think about it, and again, I'm sorry for so much politics, but it's hard in the middle of April 2025 not to talk about politics. But a lot of the work that you guys do, your projects in the U.S., are in rural settings with ranchers and farmers in connection with their grasslands, for example. And so another your programs where you invest to restore nature, principally for the ecosystem service of carbon removal, but also for biodiversity protection and water protection. But there's another benefit that's occurring. You're investing in rural economies that generally will benefit a lot from additional investment. And so whoever you are, if part of your political view is you care about supporting rural communities, this kind of environmental work delivers that positive outcome too.
And well, spot on, because I think that the direct impact that it has, and you mentioned one case in your book that really resonated with me, that when you're regenerating one of those rural settings, the value of those properties starts to increase. So it actually lifts all boats as those ecosystems become from distressed assets to performing assets. And so I think this is what we're also seeing, that the cascading effect of, pardon the pun, the wildfire effect of starting the regeneration of a ranch spreads over quite quickly, same as a forest. And so as we go through that cascade of hopefully a faster and an accelerating flywheel of regeneration, as you mentioned in the US and many of the other locations where we operate, what I wanted to ask you is a bit of crystal balling, just so the audience hears some of our virtual and in-person coffee chats, is where do you see this going in the next decade? Or where would you like to see it going?
Not to take a negative point of view, but the environmental challenges we face are huge. Obviously, climate change, we're way behind schedule in addressing climate change. It's hard to get everybody lined up to do what is necessary. And recently, we've been facing political headwinds, but we can't lose sight of that need. And, the climate challenge itself just keeps compounding. And then we have other things to worry about. We have to worry about the loss of biodiversity, which is accelerating probably at an even more alarming pace. There are water challenges. We have challenges. I could go on and on. And so it's not really good news that those challenges are on the horizon, but it does mean these issues aren't going anywhere. This is the opposite of trendy. So young people are often asking me for career advice about opportunities in environmentally oriented positions. And I say, look, you can be confident over your career. There will be a lot of work to do. Some people find this topic tiresome or discouraging because there are no easy answers. Other people find it energizing and inspiring because you're doing such important work to protect nature for future generations. Wherever you are in that spectrum, though, it's not going away. There's going to be more and more of these challenges that we face. And so it's just going to be an increasingly big part of everyone's life, I think. That's another reason why, if you're on the sidelines, get off the sidelines, pay more attention, figure out how you might get involved, because this is just part, I was going to say of the human condition, but it's a part of all species conditions right now.
Well, and I think that just what you said there on younger generations, I just had an interview with a potential candidate trying to looking to join Cultivo, and she asked me the same question that I just got from a potential investor in the business, which was, is the total addressable market big enough? Said the young individual, because she said, I want to just join an industry that has a massive total addressable market. And I said, well, I honestly cannot think of a bigger addressable market than nature, and especially degraded nature. And so I agree with you. I think there's thankfully the investor also agreed that this is one industry that just has a lot to go through, and we're just at the beginning.
One of the things I write about in my newsletter, and the reason I do so is because young people always are asking me for advice and encouragement about careers, but I can't talk to them all. So I sometimes write about, I tell young people, this is a fantastic place to devote your career. First of all, you'll spend time in nature. That's inspiring. Secondly, you're doing something important. Third, the opportunity is extraordinarily complex. Like nobody's figured out how to do all this stuff. Four, old people don't really have much of an advantage over new people because all of this is new. And so whoever is fastest and most nimble will be ahead. That's very different than most situations. So yeah, whether is it good or bad? I mean, I can be optimistic. The challenges are huge, but increasingly it's evident that more and more people understand that and are prioritizing addressing these challenges. And I really do believe as you get engaged in this kind of work, it makes you a better person. Nature helps you do that. You realize you need to be a little less self-centered or sure you're right, and instead reach out to other people and get them on board, which is a good thing for humans these days. So there's not going to be anything easy about addressing our environmental challenges on the one hand. On the other hand, against humankind pulling this off.
Here, here. Well, and almost we're coming to the end, as well as my cup of coffee. But one thing that you write on the Instigator is about all really, really interesting sci-fi books. So I just wonder, before the next list comes out, is there one that you would like to share?
Mentioned once Ministry of the Future. Forget now the name of the author. I'm getting old. Book, but boy, does it portray it's, I forget now, maybe it's 15, 20 years in the future, not that far from now. It portrays in a pretty scary way what a more climate scarred world looks like. And there's a lot of suffering and sadness on the one hand. On the other hand, in that great novel, people to some large degree rise to the challenge. And so you can argue it's a pretty optimistic take. So Ministry of the Future is a great one. How's that?
I'm in. Yeah, and it's still, and a lot of the things that novel described are becoming real as well. So on both the positive and the negative.
I mean, even that, it used to be, I used to write about those books often because there weren't that many so-called sci-fi books. It's now becoming a pretty big genre, modern literature, which I guess it's good and bad. It's bad that it's on the mind of authors, but it does show, again, people know this is important and are digging in. I want to get the name of the author, but anyway, folks, you can find it. Ministry of the Future. I'm just spacing out the author, the great author's name.
Oh, good. Thank you, Mark. It's, as always, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Manuel, and please keep up, for you and your team, keep up the great work.
Will do.